be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 52nd part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfictionnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Tom was beyond furious. Fortunately, he was in the room of lost and hidden things, so he could blast the walls to his heart's content, safe in the knowledge no one would ever know. It had taken him a month to get to the room. He had been gobsmacked to discover on his first weekend at Hogwarts that the room he had discovered that no one else knew about when he was a student, was now being used by the upper years for special classes, and as a recreation room on the weekends. He had finally managed to find a time when it wasn't in use and he could manage to escape his friends. That marvelous room packed with the debris of ages, stuffed with hidden treasures, had been thoroughly looted. It was now a nearly empty room, barely double the size of a classroom, and filled with stored furniture. Thank Merlin, he had never put anything valuable in the room. He had been intending to use it as a resource, to mine it, as it were, for items he could sell to secure some extra coin to facilitate his plans. It was what he had done the last time. It was amazing what the prefects would overlook for the right compensation. That he planned to obliviate them while they were distracted, and recover his money, was irrelevant if he didn't have the galleons to show them in the first place. Unfortunately, while his host came from a pure BLD family, they hadn't provided their offspring with more than the bare minimum he might need in school. More of his plans ruined by those bedamned ponies. Harry stopped just down the corridor from the Gryffindor entrance. He had noticed his shoelace was untied. He moved to the wall and lifted his foot to put it against that wall so he could retie the shoelace. When his foot went through the wall, instead, to say that he was startled would be an understatement. He tumbled, foot and face first into a void. There's nothing like tumbling down a dark chute to get the old adrenaline going, as he discovered. Afterwards, he insisted he did not scream like a little filly on helium, it was a very stallionly scream of sheer terror. When he slid to a stop, it was in a small, dimly lit room with an opening at the opposite end. Moments later, the rest of the herd showed up one at a time. Except Hermione. She had gone off to get a professor, or at least a prefect. They hadn't tumbled, they had jumped in. Their robes were in considerable disarray, mostly wrapped around their arms and heads, leaving everything else on rather obvious display. Fortunately, it was dark enough that Harry could pretend he hadn't seen anything he wasn't supposed to. He did see that the equestrians were ignoring Rule 12b and had left their underwear in their trunks. So had Ginny, to his surprise. He knew that Apple Bloom, Scootaloo, and Sweetie Belle, like all the equestrian ponies as humans, were generously endowed for girls their age. They weren't any match for the other, older, equestrians at the school, but, still not small by any stretch of the imagination. Plus, the fillies had never been shy about not wearing clothes around him, despite his protestations. However, seeing that Ginny was developing nicely was startling. Still, he made sure to face the other way and examine the exit as they straightened their robes in the dimly lit hall. The exit passage was in the left corner of a blank wall. After he entered it, it was a couple of steps to the right to a jog back the other way with just as many steps to the left. The dim light of the hidden room behind him, he noticed, was completely blocked. Partially in front of him, on a step-high pedestal, was a suit of armor with barely enough room to slip around on its right. He cautiously peeked out from behind the armor. He was in a corridor he had never seen, but which he had heard described. It was a broad, stone basement corridor, brightly lit, and the opposite wall was decorated with food-themed paintings. A painting of a bowl of fruit was straight across from him. The paintings and the long stack of barrels lining the wall to his side were a dead giveaway. This was the corridor to the Hufflepuff dorms, below and beside the Great Hall. Thus, he was the first unfortunately. Fortunately. To discover the slide that went from the 7th floor Gryffindor Tower corridor clear across the castle to Hufflepuff House. That it was only a very short distance to the Great Hall made it absolutely the best shortcut to meals that the Gryffindors could hope for. Why it was in the basement and not beside the Great Hall was a mystery, probably one they would never solve. While they were looking around and exploring the corridor, Sally Ann Perks came out of the Hufflepuff portal. She blinked on seeing them. "What are you all doing here?" After a brief explanation, they all decided to see if this was a one-time thing, or could be repeated. The trek back upstairs brought to Harry's mind his experiences in his mum's castle with the slides they had discovered there. He wondered if there was a hidden swimming pool, somewhere. The entrance was just like one of those castle doors that pretended to be a wall in a wide alcove. The only marker for it was that the alcove was beside a portrait of a woman writing at a desk. The herd also discovered that when anyone stepped into the alcove, anyone outside didn't notice the other had disappeared unless they had been paying close attention. It appeared to have the same kind of aversion spell that prevented muggles from noticing people disappearing, as was being used at platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station. Except this one was aimed at magicals, not muggles. It was a repeatable experience. All you had to do was jump into a wall. Using a mild sticking charm on your robes to hold them to your ankles kept them from flying up, which meant everyone was decent when they arrived in the basement. He just knew some of the equestrians would forget the 2 charms when they were with a prospective boyfriend. He thought that there must have been a variation on the arresto momentum spell on this part of the slide, as they stopped in a ridiculously short amount of space once they reached the bottom of the slide. Professors McGonagall and Flitwick showed up with Hermione as Ginny and Sally were waiting their turns. After a brief explanation, both professors took a jump. Seeing the 2 professors, and Hermione, step into the Hufflepuff corridor surprised the rest of the herd. It was predictable, but still a surprise. Their second trek upstairs made Harry wish there was a shortcut up the stairs, too. He thought about using his broom, but then he thought, what if I met someone coming down as I was going up? Not a nice thought, at all. Perhaps there was a slide that went in the opposite direction. Just put a reverse gravity spell on it like Mum had used in Ponyville, and it would be perfect. But he hadn't seen a reverse gravity spell here. Or heard of one. So, probably not. He sighed. Too bad. Once word spread of the new shortcut, Harry started to see various students, mainly first years, walking around leaning against walls, and climbing in behind suits of armor and statues. The twins did not seem surprised at the shortcut, just annoyed that it had been found and made so public. Harry had commiserated with them in the common room. There was no helping the word not getting out once the slide was discovered. Considering that it might have been dangerous, what choice did the herd have but to tell the professors? Then he mentioned that it was too bad there wasn't a reverse slide with a gravity spell. Or a slide that went to a pool, not the pool in the room of requirement. Swimming in a warm pool in February while the room was being used for a class would be quite a treat. Heck, even now would be a treat. The loch's water wasn't exactly warm, even if it was September. The twins gave each other startled glances, then smirked. The more experienced students in the castle all laughed. They claimed all the hidden passages had been discovered and that the new one was just a fluke. That dissuaded a lot of students, but a few stubborn souls persisted. The meeting, this time, was at number 10, Downing. Present were the usual British attendees, the Prime Minister, the Home and Foreign Secretaries, the Directors of Military Intelligence Departments 5 and 6, Lieutenant Searle, and Ambassador Blueblood and his secretary. The ambassador opened the meeting. First, I'm sure you will be relieved to hear that there haven't been any further incursions through the portal in Little Whinging, he said dryly. We have modified 2 of the entrances to the portal area on our side to be null magic areas. These will cancel any cast spells, illusions, or hiding magic such as were used in the previous incursions. They also detect the presence of magic such as the so-called undetectable expansion charm without cancelling them. There will be no way to sneak something or someone through in someone else's pocket using methods like that. He smiled. And, yes, we will be happy to provide you with that detection technology, he said in response to their raised eyebrows at hearing that. No one will be able to sneak past any of your checkpoints without revealing if they are using the undetectable expansion technology or illusions. He pulled a thick folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Second, the princesses agree that the technology used on the Infinity Guns, and their existence, will be a British state secret, and we will disclose its existence to no one. We will hold it as an equestrian state secret on developing and manufacturing them for you, if you so longing. He drew a paper out of the briefcase and slid it over to the Prime Minister. As far as anyone who sees the guard using such things on our side of the portal, the guard have been instructed to reply, state secret. Anyone asking higher will be told the same. We are leaving hints that we are simply using undetectable expansion technology. Anyone persisting after that point will be arrested and interrogated. We will inform you immediately should that circumstance occur. He paused. Third, the actual method for making that type of combination of special technology work in the rifles and pistols is under Fidelius technology to keep it secret. That will prevent anyone from rediscovering how to integrate and use those technologies to manufacture weapons. It will leave them available for other uses, such as cars, lorries, planes, power plants, and so forth. The Fidelius technology is set to prevent it from occurring to anyone to use the special technology in that particular manner to make a weapon, ever again. The secret keeper is Princess Celestia. Fourth, he reached again into his briefcase and took out a small metal box about the size of a deck of cards. As earlier agreed, in exchange for 100 each of modified Glock 17 pistols and ESA-82 rifles, you give us permission to non-destructively copy all the out-of-copyright or government-sponsored sound recordings and moving images stored in the British Library. He placed it atop several sheets of paper and slid that over to the Prime Minister. Castor knew that there were only about 300 special technology experts in the military, a 50-50 split between full wizards or witches and squibs. Half of those were in support positions. If things ever came to a shooting war, the weapons would be passed out to high-level guards in important facilities. A review of all their current treaties and pacts would have to be undertaken, and conditions imposed before these special weapons would be considered for practical use, in any situation. Likewise, their weapons distribution would be strictly controlled and almost non-existent. They were for emergency use only. They didn't want to tip off anyone as to the existence of these things. Talk about destabilizing the world's military situation, sheesh. The pistols would probably be doled out to MI6 special agents designated as Agents 007 3/4. There had been some lobbying for 9 3/4, but the proponents of that designation had lost out to bureaucracy. The 009 agents had an inferior skill set compared to the 007 agents. The 3/4 designation implied a nearly identical, but slightly greater, skill set. In the meantime, any personnel who might be equipped with the weapons in an emergency would undergo intensive training with the special weapons' normal counterparts. They would have to maintain their expert sniper status at all times, with regular testing. This box can only be opened by a special technology expert, Blueblood continued. Each weapon is inert until activated according to the instructions inside. Each weapon can only be operated by a special technology expert, and only after it has been personalized to that special technology expert. They do not need maintenance or cleaning. Any attempt to examine the weapon beyond simple visual, or attempting to disassemble it or the magazines, will result in their melting and violent explosion. Should the user die, the weapon will automatically melt to render reverse engineering it impossible. It cannot be switched to someone new, for obvious security reasons. He patiently waited as the Prime Minister read the papers, passed them to the 2 secretaries, and then slid the receipt back to the ambassador. If you are interested, he said in a tone of disinterest, we have modified versions of the ammunition for those weapons that are special technology enhanced. While a typical special technology shield easily can stop our special technology ammunition, they do not last against repeated shots, especially if they are rapidly fired. No special technology shields we have experimented with can survive more than a few moments on being hit at a rate of 16 special technology rounds a second. By the time the target realizes their shield is being overwhelmed, it's gone and they are not in a position to resist anymore. Castor's pistol ammunition had been enhanced by a special technology expert primarily stunning hexes. A more limited number of rounds per magazine, 17, but capable of being used by anyone. The stunning ability of the rounds would be written off by witnesses as the target passing out from being hit. Most of the special technology soldiers carried similar. It was, after all, an obvious blend of special technology and non-magical weaponry. Blue Blood side. Special technology shielding and anti-summoning special technology must be added to the weapons when facing other special technology users, however, or the wielder is vulnerable to retaliation while exposed during firing. Or they could be ambushed. Both of those special technologies can be a small accessory that attaches onto the pistol or rifle. Disguising the unit as a silencer should work. Unfortunately, the shielding can only stop a limited number of rapid hits before it will be unable to recharge quickly enough to stop them. An especially powerful, single attack could also overwhelm the shield. He pursed his lips. Neither weapon would be as versatile as a wand, but their high rate of fire would easily counterbalance any special technology defensive abilities your opponents might have or be hiding behind. Using both together would be an especially efficacious tactic. I suggest teaching your people to use the pistols in their offhands would be the best approach. He paused. It would give you almost equal footing with hostile special technology users, if things ever came to a confrontation, again. 2 weeks later, Harry noticed the Weasley twins leaving the Great Hall and heading downstairs to the Hufflepuff corridor. On a whim, he decided to follow them. The herd, naturally, followed him. There's no reason for them to go downstairs right now, he whispered as he waited at the top of the stairs for the two to leave the stairs, below them, for the corridor. Maybe they found another shortcut. You might be right, muttered Hermione. They weren't as surprised at the new passage as I think they should have been. Putting silencing spells on their shoes and clothes, they darted down just in time to see the twins disappear partway down the corridor. That's where the slide is, Sweetie Belle said with a puzzled frown. They hurried to the spot. It was the exit from the 7th floor slide, which was confusing. Wasn't that the down slide, only? Harry carefully peeked behind the statue on its right side. Then he went into left-right passage behind it and peeked into the dimly lit room at the end of the slide. There wasn't anyone there. He stepped back out and studied the armored suit. Is it my imagination, he asked, or is there more room on this side of the armored suit than I remember? He pointed to the statue's left, opposite the exit from the slide. You might be right, said Sweetie Belle. I think you're right, said Hermione at the same time. Harry carefully stepped around that side of the armor. It had a similar right-left passage. There was another small room, barely as big as a broom closet. The rest of the herd followed him, making it a bit crowded, but not uncomfortably so. Hermione cast a quick lumos, and they spent several minutes pushing and running their hands on the walls looking for a hidden exit. Scootaloo saw it first. Hey, where's the ceiling, she said. They looked up. There wasn't a ceiling, just a black hole that seemed to narrow as it stretched high into the castle. Do you think they climbed into that? Said Ginny. Don't see any hoof holes, said Apple Bloom. Then how did they get up there? Fly. They didn't seem to be carrying brooms, Harry said slowly. So, what did they do? Said Hermione, musing out loud, hands on her hips. Just go up. With a loud scream that diminished with distance, echoing eerily, Hermione shot up into the ceiling opening. The others stared at each other, wide-eyed. Well, said Apple Bloom, it can't be that dangerous or they would not have used it, right? They looked at each other. Ginny quickly hopped over and grabbed Harry around the waist just before he said, up. It was too late for him to stop her. Suddenly they were falling headfirst into the hole underneath them. After one quick startled scream, which made his ears ring, Ginny was quiet. Harry, on the other hoof, had his wand up and glowing. They could see the sides of the tunnel flashing by, but it appeared there was a magic that kept them centered in it. The tunnel narrowed, but was more than large enough for the two of them. It probably could accommodate 4 or 5 students together, or perhaps 3 adults. One Hagrid maybe. Hagrid would first have to fit behind the armored suit in the Hufflepuff corridor, which was nearly impossible if he was shrunk down by a spell. They felt the tunnel twist to the side as it got a bit wider and the ceiling lower. Harry had just realized they were on their backs when they slid into another small room. Just like the other slide, they stopped in a ridiculously short amount of space. Most assuredly, it probably had an arresto momentum type spell on it, just like the other slide. As soon as they stopped, they stood and cautiously walked on unsteady legs out of the tunnel into a small room. They immediately realized they had stepped out of a wall. There was nothing to indicate the room was anything but empty or that it led to or from anywhere. Hermione was standing in a corner, her wand in one hand and the other on her chest, catching her breath. "Well," she said, "that was a surprise." Harry and Ginny nodded. "Didn't expect that to be voice-activated," Harry said. "Makes sense, though," Ginny replied. They stood and waited for the others, which wasn't long. As soon as they were all present, and had straightened their robes, Harry headed for the obvious exit. Like the room in the Hufflepuff corridor, this one had a zigzag passage that left him looking into an empty corridor. He warily moved into the corridor and discovered he was around the corner from the hall to the Gryffindor entrance. When he looked back, there appeared to be a solid wall where he had exited. It was weird to watch the herd members suddenly appear, one by one. If he hadn't known better, he would have thought that they had been just down the corridor and he only now noticed them. Notably, looking around, there were no portraits with a view of where they were. Pressing a hand against the wall that was a door revealed it to be one way only out. This slide, they decided, to keep a secret, for a while. They would have to remember to cast a Notice Me Not charm on themselves before heading downstairs from the Great Hall after meals. Plus, keep a sharp eye on the Weasley twins to see if they knew of any other shortcuts. It would be nice to have one that went to the astronomy tower. Having to go down to the ground floor and then back up to the top of that tower was a taxing trek, especially because Gryffindor was the opposite side of the castle, and only a little bit shorter. Why the astronomy tower didn't have doors on each floor was a mystery. Debbie read through the oath, looked at Castor a moment, then reread the oath. She handed the paper to Abby. "We agree." Castor didn't bother hiding his surprise. "That quickly?" Debbie waggled her head from side to side. "We see nothing too onerous in this oath. You provide us a safe place to live, we help you as necessary, that's better than staying here. It's less than the Queen Mother asked of us, she demanded our lives. And discards us when convenient," Abby said bitterly. "That you include your obligations to us in this oath speaks well of your intentions," Debbie said as she stared at him. "It will be interesting to see how magic will enforce this oath in your world. We will obey to the intent of the oath, rather than merely to the letter." He nodded his understanding. "I thank you for that. Before we proceed further," Debbie said, "you previously asked if there were otherlings interested in going through the portal. There are. However, before any of them will come forward, they will have to be reassured that we can survive on the other side of the portal." She looked out the window for a moment, then back at him. "After all, if there is no food for us on the other side, why bother trying? We might as well just starve, here, as there. Here, at least, some of us might survive, perhaps, even, Queen Mother might let us rejoin the hive." She stared at him. "We too will go first and ascertain if this is worth doing. Only after that will we return and tell the others of our findings." Castor smiled wryly. "We thought you might say that. The princesses have already agreed to let you return to find others." He paused, thinking. How long will it take you to determine this? Depending upon where you take us, anywhere from a few hours to a week. You mentioned the possibilities of weddings, churches, and maternity hospitals, so how quickly we could arrive at such places will determine the time it takes. He nodded again. Well, I'm ready when you are, so shall we go? They stood and followed him out the door. Just outside was a contingent of 8 Special Air Services troopers. These gentlemen, Castor explained as the 2 changelings slowed at seeing them, are going to be our escorts, so that we aren't delayed on our way to the portal. He continued walking. The changelings exchanged glances but followed him. Having 4 men towering over them on each side was disquieting to the changelings, Castor saw, but his matter-of-fact presentation didn't allow them more time to react. The changelings were used to seeing men and women. This was Canterlot's UK embassy, after all, and the staff were humans, not ponies. The 2 had been guests in the embassy for the 9 days since they had arrived. What had startled them, he knew, were the obvious military garb and weapons these 8 humans wore. They were carrying the weapons casually, but in a manner that said they were ready to react at a moment's notice. Plus, unlike the pony guards, these guards were constantly scanning the area around them, as if they expected an attack, even in the embassy. It didn't escape the changelings' notice that 4 of the guards were keeping a specific watch on them. Castor led them to another room with a lit fireplace. This is a flue, he said. It is a quick method of travel between any 2 locations. To operate it is simple. Watch. The 2 lead guards stepped up to the fireplace and linked their arms together on one side. The first one pressed down on a floor-mounted pedal. A second later, the 2 changelings were startled to see the fire in the fireplace turn green. The 2 troopers then stepped into the fire and one of them said, "Ponyville Embassy Flue." They disappeared. Debbie nodded. We had heard about the FLU network, but never had the opportunity to see it used. She sighed. Instant, untraceable transportation of troops. The Lings were so behind. Minutes later, the group was exiting Ponyville Embassy to find 12 equestrian guards waiting for them. The guards made no effort to pretend they weren't there to watch the changelings. The 2 groups studied each other for a moment, then both headed for the portal station down the street. Faster than the changelings had expected, Castor was showing them how to put on the transit robes and they were stepping through the portal itself, escorted by the SAS members. They were met with 4 more soldiers, all female, when they exited the portal. Castor wasn't surprised to notice that the changelings quickly adapted to being only on 2 feet instead of 4 hooves. Nor were they unfamiliar with having hands. With their abilities, they would be able to show exactly what those other species on Equus looked like and how they behaved. A veritable goldmine of information. They had to know far more than the ponies did, who had only a cursory interest in the others who shared their planet. Much of their information seemed to fall into the category of travelogues, or, "my mother told me." Not to mention being decades or centuries old. For a modern nation, it was intolerable to be that ignorant of one's neighbors. Debbie appeared to be about 30 and Abby, based on the gray in her hair, about 50. They were dark-skinned, tall, and not nearly as buxom as the equestrian ponies when they crossed the portal. Also, unlike the equestrians, both had close-cropped hair. "These ladies," Castor said, pointing to the new soldiers, "will assist you in dressing in our clothes." He indicated the changelings should go into the room with door that had a stylized image of a woman in a dress. "Female" was written below it in several equestrian languages, as well as several from this world, it seemed. Getting dressed took some time, as Castor had expected from the first-time immigrants. Most of the time was spent in explaining what proper streetwear clothing was, and showing them the different fashions available. However, what they actually wore were simple, knee-length dresses. Once they were outside the equestrian embassy, they were brought to a nondescript bus. It was the Ling's first sight of a ponyless carriage that wasn't a train and they stared at it a long time before boarding. Once inside, they were clearly taken aback at the opulence on display: cushioned seats with a carpeted aisle, warm air circulating, and with curtain-covered windows. Not even the trains in Equestria could match this carriage. They were directed to sit in the middle of the bus, with the soldiers taking seats at the front and back. The changeling stared out the windows through the gaps in the curtains as they left the embassy grounds, taking in what they could of this new world. It was very much unlike what they were used to seeing. The closely built houses, the tall buildings, the paved roads left them quiet. The fact that the vehicle didn't jolt and sway as it moved was another point towards the comforts these humans expected. Even the road was a work of art. Soon enough, however, they pulled into a short, paved area just beside the road they were on. "Excuse me," Harry said, hurrying to catch up with Parvati Patil. Parvati, Lavender Brown, and Lily Moon were headed for the great hall doors, having left the Gryffindor table after dinner. The three fillies stopped and looked at him curiously. "Parvati," he said. "You have family back in India, right?" She nodded. "My father, mother, and sister are the only members of my family in Ireland, at the moment. Padma and I usually spend our summers at the ancestral home in India." Harry nodded. "Good." He straightened up and his tone and posture became more formal. He took a deep breath. "Her Eternal Majesty, Princess Celestia, Mstrs of the Invincible and Unconquered Sun, Bringer of the Day, Destroyer of Monsters, Bane of Evil, Guiding Hoof of the Realm, Monarch of Unicorns, Counselor of Earth Ponies, Commander of Pegasi, Matriarch of Night Ponies, and Co-Ruler of Equestria and their other realms and territories," he said loudly. He had the attention of the entire Great Hall at this point. "Her Eternal Majesty, Princess Luna, Mstrs of the Stars and Moon, Bringer of the Night, Guardian of Dreams and Destroyer of Nightmares, Bane of Evil, Defender and Grand General of the Realm, Matriarch of Night Ponies, Monarch of Unicorns, Counselor of Earth Ponies, Commander of the Pegasi, and Co-Ruler of Equestria and their other realms and territories, and Her Royal Highness, Twilight Sparkle, Princess of Friendship, Mstrs of Magic, Bearer of the Element of Magic, Savior of Equestria. Liberator of the Crystal Empire, biggest egghead ever." His lips quirked as he suppressed his smile at that last one. Several in the hall broke into snickers. It still infuriated his mum that the royal sisters had made that last bit part of her official title. She still muttered about Trelestia whenever it came up. "Would like to inquire if your family would be willing to assist them in opening an equestrian embassy to the Indian magical government. The purpose of the embassy would be primarily cultural, as the culture of India appears to be a rich and diverse one. The princesses expect that the exchange will be interesting, profitable, and delightful, to all parties." He reached inside his right pocket. It was expanded and pulled out a golden tube that was 3 fingers thick and as long as his forearm. It had the equestrian seal, made from hundreds of tiny jewels, repeated around it so that at no time could you not see the seal and not know the tube's origin. Larger gems decorated the ends, and were embedded throughout its length in geometric patterns. "Should your family feel that this is a task better suited for another," he continued in the same formal tone, "the princesses request that your family pass this missive on to the most appropriate personage or authority." He held out the tube to her in both his hands. "Your family, of course, will be generously compensated for their assistance in this matter, regardless." He bowed, still holding the tube out to an astonished Parvati. "Please convey this message to your head of family, at your earliest convenience." The witch hesitantly took the tube, staring at him and his herd, who were also bowing except Ron. Ron wasn't in his herd, although he was with them. The tube had the heavy feel of pure gold. The gems which decorated it were worth a king's ransom, and the artistry of the inlaid seal and the other designs was breathtaking. The end cap had Bharatavarsha Confederation written in Hindi on one line and in English on the next, and India below that. All were written with tiny inlaid rubies. Harry and the herd straightened. "The princesses eagerly await your family's response." He paused a moment as she stared at the tube in wide-eyed wonder. He grinned and relaxed. "The end with the emeralds unscrews, although it has a wax seal, too, right now. The message tube's also indestructible, and becomes lightweight and shrinks when you tie it to a bird's leg." Parvati looked back up at him. send this out immediately, she said. He bowed briefly, again. You don't have to rush off, it's not urgent or anything like that, he said. Mum said any time before the end of the year is fine. Oh. I almost forgot. The tube is a portkey for itself. So, when they're ready to respond, put the answer in the tube, tap it with a wand, and say, return to the equestrian embassy, and it'll go. That's in the letter inside, too. He smiled again. Thanks for your help. Sure, she said uncertainly, looking at her friends. Then he added, the princesses also told me to mention that any witch, wizard, or squib can visit any equestrian embassy and request asylum. Any equestrian embassy. He stared at her intently until she nodded. He nodded and smiled back. Thank you, he said. He turned and looked back out into the great hall. Is Sully still here? He said quietly. Apple Bloom, the tallest, went on tiptoes and looked at the Ravenclaw table. Yep. I can see her. The Indian witch, seeing him turn away, started back out the great hall doors. Her friends went with her, all chattering excitedly, and studying the message tube with oohs and ahs. The rest of the hall was also chattering excitedly. Everyone had expected something all day. Harry's phoenix, at least they thought Philomena was Harry's, had flamed into the great hall at breakfast and delivered a package to him. When nothing more momentous had occurred immediately after that, they had assumed something would happen later. This exceeded their expectations, a diplomatic mission that involved the Atlanteans reaching out of England. No doubt there would be a rush on the Ollery this evening. Harry nodded. I think we should wait here instead of interrupting her dinner. The others nodded. It wasn't a long wait. Sully had noticed that they were watching her. Lisa Turpin, Mandy Brocklehurst, Isabel McDougall and Padma Patil all accompanied her, their curiosity clearly aroused. As soon as Sully stopped in front of him, Harry stiffened up, and delivered almost the same message. The only differences were, naturally, that he mentioned China's long cultural history. The message tube had the first two lines in Chinese, and China, in English, as the third line on the cap. By this time, the headmaster had made his way to them, and stood nearby, quietly listening and observing. Harry sighed after finishing his spiel with Sue. The headmaster should have waited, according to Blue Blood, if it concerned him. If it didn't, then coming to meet Harry was inappropriate. Unfortunately, the headmaster's curiosity had gotten the better of him. Harry had planned to go to the head table anyway. He turned to face Dumbledore. Princess Twilight asked me to tell you that asking for the ministry's help in contacting the magical governments of India and China might imply that the English ministry had some sort of influence over Equestria's actions. She also said that asking for your assistance as the supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards was considered. However, given your additional positions as headmaster of Hogwarts and chief warlock of the Wizengamot, that might give the same impression, anyway. Hence, the princess's decision to use this approach. No slight or insult was intended towards your person or positions. Harry bowed. The headmaster inclined his head. No insult taken, he murmured softly. Please tell the princesses that if there is anything in which I might be of assistance, to please contact me at their convenience. I would be happy to help. Harry nodded again. The headmaster nodded back and turned to head out of the great hall. No doubt he was headed to his office. Harry sighed again. So, he said, turning back to the herd and Ron, shall it be the library or the dorm? He looked at his friends inquisitively. Library, said Hermione, Sweetie Belle, and Neville, who had joined them. Dorm, said Scootaloo, Apple Bloom, and Ginny. Ron groaned. Library, he said dispiritedly. Harry stared at Ron, stunned as did everyone else. I got a Transfigurations paper due tomorrow morning. Hermione stared at him, aghast. That paper was assigned a week ago, she said accusingly. He shrugged. She rolled her eyes, and started for the library. The rest followed. And Borgia slowly closed the book after rereading it and stared out over Diagon Alley. It was an interesting read. She looked back at the cover and studied the two names written there, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It reminded her tremendously of what that evil mayor had stolen from her, which still made her grind her teeth. However, it concentrated on the concept of socialism as a natural result of the conflicts inherent in the capitalist system instead of the inherent conflicts of cutie magic as practiced by ponies. She had discovered the topic during one of her excursions into Nocturne Alley, into one of the bars. She had been visiting each gathering place of workers, trying to determine their opinions of the current governing system. None of them liked the ministry. They all complained about the corruption, favoritism, cronyism, discrimination, and prejudice patently obvious in its everyday operation. A half-BLD had jokingly said, "It's time to overthrow the bourgeoisie, it's time for a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains." A loud cheer had erupted from those closest, followed a moment later by louder laughter. Then more grumbling about how it would be an improvement, impossible though it was. It had confused her at first, and she had pretended to be an ignorant half-BLD, asking for more information. Which had led to this book, and another, Das Kapital, and a few more besides. She had found the books in the convenient bookstore just outside the Leaky Cauldron. His theories, while interesting, had only a small impact on magical beings. While the magicals did work on a mostly capitalist system, it was far more feudal in actual operation and governance. The seats on the Wiesengemot were, for the most part, hereditary. Except for department heads and winners of the Order of Merlin, first class, medal. Old families, like the nobility Marx railed against, wanted to keep the status quo. They would resist changing unfair laws and rules, simply because, that's the way we've always done it. This also meant the laws were heavily biased in the favor of those same old families. The members were not about to pass a law that disadvantaged themselves or their families. It reminded her quite a lot of how the sisters ran Equestria. Using her native pony magic had made it easy to establish close friendships with the secretaries who really ran the bureaucracy. After an accidental meeting at a store, they would tell their new best mate everything they knew about the ministry. They were more than happy to air their gripes about their jobs. With their input, it was foolishly easy to map out the politics and power blocks. She quickly determined who would make for a steadfast ally or opponent. She found herself enjoying the challenge. She would use her limited influence behind some of the efforts of the princess's pawn, Dumbledore. Much as she hated the three princesses, in this case, through Dumbledore, they were trying to correct injustices. It would be hypocritical of her to oppose them simply because she hated the way the princesses treated the ponies, Equestria, and Equus in total, as their toys. On the other hoof, the discrimination in Equestria was more of social standing than anything else except for those hated cutie marks. Not like here where personal pedigree mattered the most. Muggleborns and half-bloods were frozen out of many positions simply because of their BRTH. Their abilities, intelligence, and knowledge had no impact on their acceptance or advancement. The discrimination against those who were not a witch or wizard was even worse. Entire classes of beings were excluded, and treated as no more than animals. Their treatment of werewolves was simply criminal, for example. However, that last would soon be a non-issue, given the discovery that visiting Equestria during full moons was a cure. Although the witches and wizards preferred to call it Atlantis, for some bizarre reason. The Daily Prophet was in the habit of starting every story about them with, the Atlanteans, who prefer to be called Equestrians. The concentration of wealth in the hands of so few in magical England was an accurate reflection of the situation in Canterlot. While the ponies and magicals were not like the destitute peasants mentioned in Marx and Engels' book, they were disadvantaged and kept downtrodden by those that thought they were superior. The ponies living in the countryside were much more egalitarian, in that respect. In this witchery world, hiding as they were, that wasn't a possibility. Marx's theories on the equal division of labor and profit were fundamentally flawed, unfortunately, she could see. Just because he and Engels loved the work they did, didn't mean every pony did. If given a chance, many ponies would do the minimum amount of work possible, regardless of their own potential to do more. She had seen that in her town, equality. Some ponies worked very hard, others in the same field of endeavor, as little as possible. She hadn't cared. If they were happy with the earnings they made, she wasn't about to criticize their work ethic. It was none of her business. Marx's socialism, however, was a different beast. It was unfair to take the total of the result of the people, combine it together, and simply divide it equally. The hard worker would become disillusioned at being punished for her consistent labor by receiving less, while the slacker would be rewarded for doing little. The result of such an approach would be poor yields and shoddy products. No pony would be happy with the outcomes. One book, The History of the Communist Soviet Union, had explained how Stalin, in post-imperial Russia, had originally imposed true communism on the farmers in the country. He had established large collective farms where hundreds worked together to grow crops. 6 months later, he had had to abandon that plan in the face of open revolt by the entire farming community, 80% of the total population. It seemed people did not like seeing slackers take advantage of their hard work. The hard workers felt they should get more of the bounty they produced. Imagine that. What a surprise. Who would have thought that people would be like that? Only a rich bourgeoisie would not realize this. Which described both Marx and Engels. The literacy rate was extremely high at the time in their homeland compared to other countries. Unfortunately, only the rich could afford advanced schooling in Imperial Germany. Who also excluded most Maras. Stalin had changed to a hybrid system where farmers were allowed large gardens of their own that they could tend to when they weren't working in the collective's fields. They were allowed to sell and trade from their gardens without interference. The only rule was they couldn't have employees. But having a friend help in exchange for food? That was all right. Those gardens, it turned out, usually outproduced the collective's fields, even though the gardens were much, much smaller. Marx's pure communism, predictably, was a failure. On the other hoof, his idea of worker-owned businesses, and labor unions, wasn't. So, her solution was to have the workers own the large businesses. The small ones were not an issue as they were usually run by the ones doing the work, anyway. Which reminded her. She needed to give her workers in the daily profit a bonus. She had given them a raise when she had hit 51% of the stock ownership and taken control of the company. The remaining stock owners had immediately complained about the decrease in their earnings. She, in turn, had then offered to buy their stock. Several had been foolish enough to agree. With her current 57% ownership, none could deny her the improvements she sought. Reporting the news and not the slander pushed by the ministry had garnered the news parchment much attention. A few discreet spells that pushed for accuracy in the stories, and loyalty to her, had been a help. Inspired by the raises, the staff worked harder than before to bring in interesting stories. Revenues had risen as a result. It was only proper that the staff should share in the additional profits. She would make it a regular, monthly, payout, with the reward slanted towards those on the bottom. They needed the extra more than the ones at the top. It was amusing that what she earned in stock dividends from the business wasn't even half of what the editor-in-chief earned. But it was more than sufficient for what she needed for necessities, as well as a few luxury items when she wanted to spoil herself when combined with her other investments. In the meantime, she needed to do a bit more research on which businesses belonged to which old families. Then she would either purchase the business and sell it to the workers, or blackmail or magic the owner into paying fair wages and offering bonuses for business improvements. Sirius, she figured, would be a good ally in that he didn't care about money. She could convince him to join her in setting up independent businesses. She might even be able to start up competition, and hire away the owner's employees. She was sure they would abandon their employer for better paying jobs doing the same thing. To prevent her competitor from simply hiring new employees, she would begin spreading the idea of unions the next time she visited Nocturne Alley. After all, if it is right and proper for a business pony to maximize their profits by efficiently organizing their business resources, both physical and labor, then it is also right and proper for the laborers to maximize their wages by efficiently organizing themselves in return. In the meantime, she needed to start work on undermining some of the ministry blockades to her plans, such as the odious toad-like senior undersecretary to the minister. Umbridge would fight every move away from the purebloods holding all the power, and could see. There were others who were objecting to the reforms the chief warlock was pushing through the Wizengamot. It was time for the Daily Prophet to start a campaign to bring those dissident voices under control. Tom found himself in a quandary. Not the possession, that was proceeding apace quite nicely. No one suspected a thing. His host was a bit surly, but then he was always a bit surly. As long as he did what he was told, the soon-to-be-restored Lord Voldemort was satisfied. The SWCH from a first-high Hufflepuff to a second-year Slytherin had gone off without a hitch. The first-high had been a good choice, in the beginning, but getting close to his former lieutenant, Malfoy, was a better ploy. A confundus at the right time, a silver knife from his potions kit for the BLD letting, and a mild command to write in the diary the first time had been all he needed. The plus to it all, which he hadn't expected, was that having BLD from both his victims linking to the diary meant he was getting a flow of soul energy from both. True, the flow from his first victim was small because he wasn't writing in the diary, but it was there. If he could get several others as donors, he wouldn't need a sacrifice to get embodied. But where was the fun in that? It would be so much more satisfying if he could drain this fool dry. The fool's father would mourn his death, searching endlessly for his killer and vowing terrible vengeance. He'd never suspect that the one he served, the one whose feet he kissed in supplication, was the very one who had done the deed. Ah, delicious irony. For now, he could pick up from Malfoy's spawn what was happening among his Death Eaters. The boy knew far more than his father expected. An occasional confundus made the intelligence gathering something anyone could accomplish. Torturing him afterwards, healing the damage, and obliviating him of the incidents was ever so much fun. The incurable brain damage of too many obliviations would slowly accumulate over the year. A fair punishment for his father deserting the Dark Lord 11 years ago, seeking only his own glory. Those some had abandoned him. While Tom had been sleeping as a Horcrux, his original had been wandering the mortal plane as a wraith. They should have been easily able to track him down and restore him. His dark mark would have been a guiding beacon to anyone with the brains God gave a goldfish. Yet, his loyal, faithful, devoted followers hadn't bothered. Traitors. Unless his other self had been stupid and not warned his closest lieutenants what to do should he appear to have died. After all, if they didn't know he was a wraith, how would they know to look for him? Telling them he had gone further down the path to immortality than anyone had ever done before wasn't telling them anything useful. Then again, maybe he had told them and they had decided to abandon him. His followers should have known he wasn't gone, in any case. Their dark marks hadn't disappeared. The biggest mystery was what had happened all those years ago. How had a toddler managed to defeat the greatest wizard of all time? Truthfully, he doubted the toddler had done anything except make a mess in his diapers. His parents had, undoubtedly, laid a subtle trap for him. The problem was, how had they known he was going to attack them? Why had he specifically targeted a toddler in the first place? The boy wizard did have impressive control of his magic and animagus before even coming to Hogwarts. Plus, he had been the center of a number of massive changes in Hogwarts, including removing problematic professors and instigating a complete overhaul of the spells protecting the castle. Yes, he would keep the boy under as close observation as possible. It would be child's play to subvert a few Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs to report on the boy. He would find the truth and exact his revenge in both cases. However, his current host was more than happy to help the Dark Lord regain power. It was just too bad that the fool didn't know it meant his life was forfeit. No need to worry about that. It was fitting that the son of a former Death Eater would be sacrificed to bring him back. It showed such dedication to his MSTR. He snickered quietly to himself. No, the problem was with the Atlanteans. By all that he had read in the Daily Prophet, stealing the news parchment after Malfoy discarded it was child's play. Atlantis was a paradise compared to Britain. So much magic was there that they had never heard of a squib. Magic permeated everything to the degree that they had never needed to invent wands or any other magical foci. The flood of first years had seemed to indicate that their population was similar to England's, a potentially rich source of new followers. Especially those that felt disadvantaged. But then his former host had talked with several of them. Discovering that they had been chosen from among 1,000 others of the same age had been earth-shaking. Simple math had told him that meant they had a population 8 times that of Wizarding England. Which meant they had more magic users than all but 2 countries, China and India. Then another had told him that the 1,000 were the volunteers out of the total 40,000 11-year-old students. Again, simple math had told him that that meant they had more magic users than all the countries on the planet. One country, with more magic users than the rest of the planet. It was mind-boggling. His old plan of destroying the purebloods, while milking them of every galleon they had, was passé. Oh, he had no doubt they would flock to him once they discovered he was back. However, the Atlanteans had changed the whole dynamic. The younger adults might want to restore the old ways, but not the older adults. The family heads would be more interested in adding the Atlantean magical heritage to their lines. No squibs for the last 1,000 years, minimum. What old family wouldn't want that for their heirs? Not to mention that every single one of the Atlanteans had managed an animagus form before he or she arrived at the school. The Atlanteans were the envy of every old family in the United Kingdom. Probably the world, once the other countries heard the stories. The next generation, after one of their parents married an Atlantean, would demonstrate to the Muggle-born just how outclassed they were in the wizarding world. That would quickly set things to the right, as far as the family heads were concerned. There was no need for a rebellion, especially when it might result in the death of a child of theirs. Not when that same child could be gaining a new magically powerful husband or wife from Atlantis. If he were to go back to the old tactics he had apparently used, which several books in the library dissected in exquisite detail, the Ministry might ask for the Atlanteans' military assistance. If the ratio of Aurors to public was the same in Atlantis as it was in the rest of the world, it meant they had nearly twice as many Aurors as England had wizards. Any attempt to foster rebellion would be crushed by the sheer military presence brought to the battlefield. He wouldn't be able to bribe them, nor entice them, to support his efforts from inside the Ministry. With an independent force in the Ministry, any operation he tried to implement would quickly get a response that far outnumbered any he might be able to field. Just look at how they had responded to a threat to just one of their students at Hogwarts last year. They had fielded a force beyond anything the English Aurors could have. Plus, they did so in a matter of minutes with a competence that put the Aurors to shame, according to the second-year and older students. He didn't dare attract their attention unless he had an army at his beck and call. Even then, it was a losing proposition as they fielded a force double or triple what he could manage. Making matters worse, from his perspective, was that the Atlanteans didn't even understand the issues concerning the pure BLD, half BLD, and Muggleborn. As far as they were concerned, everyone could do magic, so what was the problem? In addition, with such a huge population, if someone felt they were being discriminated against in one location, they simply moved somewhere else where they weren't. He would have to rethink everything. He wouldn't get financing from the old families because they wouldn't want to rock the boat while things were in a state of flux with the Atlanteans. In 10 years or so, after things had settled down to routine, he might garner some interest if things weren't working out as the family heads had imagined. But it was just as likely that they would be pleased with their efforts so far and not inclined to back him. He had no idea of the political and social situation in Atlantis. The students from there were remarkably close-mouthed. He had learned that they were a theocracy of some kind, with a royal family of 3 princesses being in charge. 2 of the princesses, the students claimed, were over 1,000 years old. They had nothing but praise for the one they called Celestia, and even used her name the same way some wizards and witches called on Merlin. The one called Luna wasn't nearly as well liked. There was a bit of mystery about the second one. He had heard one student say she had been banished for the last 1,000 years and only recently returned. 1,000 years. However, they had nobles who ran the country somewhat like the Waisengamot ran England. Having what appeared to be a monoculture, no Muggle-born, half-bloods, or even ones that they would consider foreigners, Atlanteans appeared quite happy with the status quo. Which meant he had no hope of gathering followers and power from ponies discontented with the status quo. On the other hand, princesses who were well over 1,000 years old. That bore some serious contemplation. While he was a Horcrux, and thus had the potential to be immortal, the body he lived in wasn't. It would grow old and die, he assumed. It would live a long time, sure, but eventually it would die. Would he be able to switch to a new body? If he was killed in battle or his body died, would he survive death as the original soul had? Or would he just dissipate? The ability to take over a body from the diary was built into the spells, but once he was in a body, would he be able to still do that? Or would he just disintegrate? Being a Horcrux, he wasn't sure if he could use the soul ritual. If he could, would it protect him? Or only the original? After all, the purpose of a Horcrux was to enable the primary soul to persist in this plane, not the other way around. Did he dare take the chance? In both cases the downsides far outweighed the upsides. Once he was embodied, he should visit Equestria. It wouldn't hurt to spend a few years investigating how those two had achieved their apparent immortality. Yes. First, he would embody himself. Then go to Atlantis to learn what he could of immortality. Then return here and retrace his original's travels to learn the magics he had learned. Once that was done, he would decide what to do next. Unusually, Scootaloo and the rest of the herd did not wake him that morning by traipsing into his dorm out of this trunk. Surprised at his uninterrupted routine, he rushed through it wondering what was wrong. He reached the common room just in time to meet Scootaloo and the other fillies as they leisurely came down from their room. With them was Chirpy Hooves, a filly with light gold and pale yellow hair, and grayish-purple eyes. Harry knew she was a Pegasus filly at home, and one of the 3 furs ties without a cutie mark. Chirpy wants us to help her find her cutie mark, said Sweetie Belle as they walked over to Harry. We spent several hours last night talking to her, said Apple Bloom. They had spent most of the late evening going over her equestrian likes and dislikes, she explained. She likes reading in general, and found the magic they were learning fascinating. But nothing else really stood out from everything she had done back home. She sighed. We'll talk some more over breakfast, finished Sweetie Belle. On the way to the Great Hall, Hermione asked, Well, Chirpy, is there anything you've seen or done at Hogwarts that you find interesting? Chirpy said, clearly considering it. Well, magic, of course, that's really interesting, but I don't think I'd get a cutie mark in it. Quidditch is kinda cool, but I'm not a fanatic about it. She was quiet for a few steps. I do find the wizarding world itself fascinating, though. The history Professor Lupin is teaching us is incredible, so violent. She shuddered. Then one of my dorm mates told me that Padma Patil is from India, so I started asking her questions. She skipped ahead a step and turned to face them, walking backwards. Did you know they have an entire pantheon of gods? She looked awed at the thought of more than 3. Some of them sound almost as powerful as Princess Celestia. She frowned, but the princess insists she isn't a god. She shook her head. Anyway, it is just so fascinating that I don't know what to say. And then she told me about Su Li being Chinese, and introduced me to her. China is just as interesting, with just as many gods. It would be so interesting to search for them. Harry could see she was quite excited at the prospect. Especially as she continued on that topic all the way through the meal and back to the common room with them. She named the Hindu and Chinese pantheons. And gave their basic descriptions and backstories. She was a lot like his mum, he thought, only focused on the topic of the Hindu and Chinese old gods, and how they were so different from each other, and alike at the same time. So very different from what they had known back home in Equestria, where there were only princesses Celestia, Luna, and cadence, and practically everyone knew everything about them. Princess Celestia's reaction to the Great Toothpaste War was taught to every colt and filly in their first year at school as a cautionary tale. That there were cultures with dozens, or hundreds, of gods was breathtaking to the ponies. Religion, praying for guidance, was a foreign concept to them. Harry had a good idea of what her cutie mark was going to be, although the 3 cutie mark crusaders hadn't sorted it out, yet. While the fillies were preoccupied with that, he excused himself and went looking for Bon Bon. After he explained what he wanted, she promised he would have it late that afternoon. When the bus stopped in the lobby, Castor turned to the 2 changelings. "This is Second Lieutenant Harrison, she's a wand user." He pointed to a woman who had been waiting for them on the bus with the driver. "We refer to all magic on this side of the portal as special technology." He stared at the 2 changelings. "Got that? Never say the word magic when you see it. It is always to be referred to as special technology. There are exceptions, however, such as telekinesis. I'll explain the whys and wherefores later." As he was saying this, the bus driver was shutting down the electronics in the bus, and disengaging the battery. The 2 nodded their understanding. "Lieutenant Harrison will conduct the casting of the oath," he continued, and handed them 2 sheets of paper. "The words you need to say are in bold red, I will be speaking the lines in green. Harrison will be the initiator of the special technology. Are we clear?" They nodded again and looked at the papers. "First," Harrison said, "all 3 of you clasp your right hands together." After they did so, she rested her wand tip on their hands and nodded to Castor. "I, Captain Castor James Searle, with the Queen's permission, am acting as surrogate for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, Queen by the grace of God, of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, as well as the people who live under her reign." Everyone watched as a bright red rope of light wrapped around his hand. A thin, red band shot off out of the bus. As the 2 changelings identified themselves, separate ropes of light, in different colors, wrapped their hands. Then they stated their obligations towards each other, each statement creating a separate white roped light. At the very end, they concluded in chorus, "As we have sworn, so shall it be." The separate ropes all merged, and a wave of white seemed to pulse outward from them. After blinking away the spots in their vision, "Well, hopefully, that will do the job," Castor said. "Take a seat and I'll explain our itinerary for the next 2 days." He smiled. "And answer your questions." He looked at the driver and nodded. "We're ready. Head for our destination." As they were being driven, Castor explained that their first stop would be at a military hospital, the maternity ward. The future use of a maternity ward as a food source would be based on their reports. They would be queried on if they could determine if there were any ill effects on the infants, the mothers, or the hospital staff while collecting their emotional food. The government also needed a baseline estimate on how long it took to gather a suitable quantity of food for the changelings. Any indications that the babies, their parents, or the staff were negatively affected by the changelings collecting would strike that particular option off the list of acceptable places. He would decide, from their reports, if they would be investigating any other hospitals to see if their wards might significantly differ in yields. The second lieutenant took advantage of that time to transfigure their dresses into proper nurses' uniforms, with name tags that labeled them as special technology trainees. When they arrived at the hospital, it was only Castor, Harrison, a second female special technology second lieutenant, and the 2 changelings that debarked. The 3 humans were attired as hospital workers to match the changelings. The bus left as soon as they entered the hospital's front doors, to return the soldiers to base. Castor had a much smaller vehicle he would call to pick them up when they finished here. There was no need for the soldiers now that the changelings had given their oath. If the spell wasn't going to work, it would be better to find out now than when they had possibly dozens of the creatures running around. After checking in at the receiving desk, they headed straight for the maternity ward. Castor gave the 2 changelings a running description of where they were in the hospital, explaining the different sections as they passed them. It was interesting to see how comfortable they were in their new bodies, and walking on two legs. He also noticed that sometimes they would slow down as they walked by certain rooms, or give puzzled looks at some of the people, both patients and staff, as they passed them. Soon enough, they were in the maternity ward. Castor stopped at the first occupied room, a single room. The new mother was sitting in her bed, cradling her newborn. She looked up, smiling as they entered. "Good day," Castor said cheerfully, a warm feeling in his heart at seeing the infant and mother. "How are you feeling this fine morning?" "Tired, still," she said happily. He stopped at the bottom of her bed and picked up the clipboard with her information. "I see you gave BRTH to this wonderful little girl last night at 10:57. He looked up at her, watching as the two changelings moved to either side of the bed. They were staring at her rather intently. "To keep her distracted," he said, "do you have any suggestions for us on how we can improve our department? Make things more comfortable beforehand, perhaps?" He continued his banter until Debbie gave the agreed-upon signal and they left. He stopped outside the next room and gave the two a questioning look. They just nodded, and Abby whispered, "We were able to collect from her. The baby was a blank, we felt nothing from her, and took nothing." He nodded and they moved on. Given the number of hospitals in the city, the current population, and the average number of babies born in a day, there were only 10 occupied rooms in this hospital. However, this hospital wasn't the largest in the city, either. "This has possibilities," Debbie said after they climbed into the Land Rover Castor had called. "Not nearly as much the ponies, but one of us could collect enough in one day to last for 2 days. We did not have to directly draw, so there shouldn't be any repercussions for either the parent or the full child," added Abby. "To give you a comparison," continued Debbie, "a similar number of new mother ponies would give a collector about a month's worth in a day." They decided to visit 3 more civilian hospitals before calling it finished and heading for a secure location in a nearby military base. Castor continued his briefing on what to expect in the human world, and what they might be asked to do. Administrator David Williams and Director General Arthur Pryor, both of the British National Space Centre, Yuri Koptev, the Director for the Russian Space Agency, Jean-Marie Luton, the French Director General of the European Space Agency, retired Vice Admiral Richard H. Truly of NASA, Ambassador Blueblood of Equestria, Ambassador Ma Yuzhen of China, and a score of lesser dignitaries were enough of a crowd, thought Major Thomas. However, the number of reporters and press members at the Audubon Army Training Estate, Britain's largest live-fire military training estate, was simply ridiculous. It was Wednesday, October 28, and 4 in the afternoon. They were all studying the modified Bristol Bloodhound Mark II missile with Ad Astra II emblazoned on its nose and its mount. The technicians were giving it one final check-over before launch in just half an hour, at 4:39. With the success of the moon mission, the Queen had shifted from a lukewarm appreciation of exploring space to full gung-ho admiration. Especially when she heard how pleased Princess Luna was with her gift. Similarly, Parliament, controlled by the Conservative Party, had changed from quiet critiques about wasting money, to wholehearted support. Their base had been energized and bragging about Britain being a major player in a field that, to now, had been dominated by the Yanks. Especially so since it had been so cheap compared to the Yanks' efforts. That had led to quick turnaround in opinion. Today's Bloodhound looked exactly like the previous one that had stood on this very spot just 7 months ago, a decommissioned unit. The ramjets that normally powered the anti-aircraft missile in flight had been discarded. The ramjet's fuel tanks in the core missile had been replaced with a single, large kerosene and liquid oxygen thruster, and its attendant fuel tanks. Its fresh coat of paint, with the BNSC logo proudly displayed on its side, however, tended to give the impression it had been purpose-built for this launch. The insides, too, had been heavily modified, not that those in attendance knew the specifics. Unlike the previous missile, the fuel tank was an expansion enlarged and holding thousands more pounds of fuel than it should. Instead, each small, sealed, fuel tank held only enough fuel for 1 second. A special duplication charm in a module at the top of the nozzle was copying the fuel from the tanks and injecting it into the combustion chamber. The magically duplicated fuel only needed to last half a second, and was consumed in less than a fraction of that time. As soon as the spell timed out, the remains returned to the magic that had made them. It was the ultimate in a non-polluting, recyclable, infinite fuel. All the press knew, however, was that equestrian special technology had provided a vastly more powerful fuel. It had taken a crew of 5 special technicians working together to create the module. It was as permanent a charm as it was possible to create. The specification was for it to last 15 years. It would probably last forever like the rest of the missile. Closest to the engines was the port key, no, Thomas corrected himself, the translocator container. It had 20 time translocators for set distances approximate, of course. The first 4 would be at the distances where the different gas giants orbited, the 5th would be at the rim of the solar system, the outside edge of the Kuiper belt, and at 50 times the distance the Earth is from the Sun. The 6th at 1 light day. The 7th at 1 light week, then 1 month, half a year, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and so forth to 10 years. The light time distances were all estimates. The plan was to get it as close to 70% light speed as possible. The Russian scientists insisted they had calculated things precisely to take in the effects of Lorentz time dilation. They also insisted their onboard computer could easily handle any in-flight adjustments and corrections to its flight path, as necessary. It used gyroscopes to maintain its attitude. Major Thomas reserved judgment. The proof would be in the pudding, was his thought. To help verify the distance covered, each port key was attached to a camera facing back to Earth, with time marks. Well, there really was only one lens, set towards Earth. The cameras all sat safely with their port keys and used special technology to use the same lens and record the last minute before the respective translocator engaged. The missile would decelerate to a stop at 11 years out, and attempt to translocate to the special moon orbital target for retrieval, Lagrange 5. If everything went to plan, it would arrive back in 12 years for analysis and reuse. Or placement in a museum, whichever would be more appropriate. Next from the engine was the payload package. It was actually the top stage of the Ad Astra. It would separate from the Bloodhound at the 2 light-year mark. Once it was a safe distance from the Bloodhound, it would begin decelerating. If everything went perfectly it would come to a relative stop at edge of the Alpha Beta Centauri system. It would spend several days taking hundreds of pictures, deploy a translocator target, and then return with its own translocator. The scientists in BNSC, NASA, ESA, and Roscosmos had been very upset about their inability to come up with a viable platform with more complex scientific instruments in the short time they were given. Actually, frothing with rage was probably more accurate. If the translocators worked at that distance, Thomas not so unconsciously crossed his fingers those scientists might be able to go there in person in 6 years with a complete suite of instruments. That promise was about the only reason why most hadn't quit and stormed off to sulk. If the translocators failed after a certain point in space before then, they would have to resort to their backup plan for interstellar exploration. It was a bit more inconvenient, but doable. They would have a backup Bloodhound prepped for immediate launch with the designated instrument package, in the meantime. It didn't hurt to be prepared, and they had a few years to prepare a proper package for the Alpha Beta Centauri system, regardless of which way things turned out. The visitors were giving the missile and its launch rig a critical eye. BNSC was using the original mount, no need, really, to change that. It made things much simpler. For the mount, the missile weighed just the right amount for a fully fueled missile. Koptev looked over to Pryor. "This will achieve near light speed," he said skeptically. The others mirrored his disbelief. The director nodded. Using the special technology the equestrians have provided, it should hit 70% the speed of light in 28 days, without a problem. He smiled. "We launched the first Bloodhound with their tech in April, and we just received confirmation it has already reached Jupiter's orbit. Something no one would have believed was possible 6 months ago." He nodded at the waiting missile. "We've improved on the technology since then, and Ad Astra 2 will put the first to shame. And the equestrians have this in their own world, someone asked a bit incredulously. The director shook his head wryly. They are a peculiar race. The whole concept of different worlds around different stars never even occurred to them. Instead, they explored portals and different dimensions. As a result, they never considered using rockets to explore space. They've only used them for fireworks and the like. Thomas spoke up. That's changing, however. Ambassador Blueblood came closer to the cluster of top officials. Our solar system has no gas giants, and the other planets are all the size of your moon or smaller, he explained. The night sky, while appealing, did not hold anything that we particularly wanted to see any closer. He sighed. He smiled ruefully. And Princess Luna is rather particular about who she would let step onto her moon. The others nodded a bit uncertainly. Most still did not quite believe that the royal sisters actually controlled celestial bodies. Yes, said Truly, the lack of anything interesting closer than the next star would put a damper on that sort of pursuit. He glanced at the others. Going from a shot at the moon to a shot at the stars with nothing in between. He shook his head. On the other hoof, Blueblood said, we have several ponies wanting to join your space agencies. He gave the others a speculative look. The director of the BNSC was looking gleeful at that news. The others merely looked thoughtful. Thomas could almost read their thoughts. Would having a pony in their program give them a leg up on the competition for the Buran? Would they get priority access to the special technology for their own programs? The warning siren sounded and the group slowly moved over to the new, partially underground launch control building. Part of it was a garage in which the actual Bloodhound launch control vehicle was parked. The press was moved back to their prepared, concrete berms at a greater distance. The head technician looked up. Everything is green. We couldn't ask for better weather conditions, and the airspace is clear. David and Arthur just nodded. The launch schedule wouldn't be changed unless something went wrong. So far, nothing had. The 4 solid propellant boosters were unchanged from the original. They would fire for only 3 seconds, but in those 3 seconds they would push the missile to Mach 2.5, or 857 meters per second. It was an acceleration that would pulp a human, nearly 29 times the Earth's gravity. The group moved into the bunker and jockeyed for good positions behind the reinforced glass to watch. Just like the first time, the launch was spectacular. One moment the missile was on its mount, the next it wasn't. Even knowing where to look, Thomas lost sight of the missile almost instantly. The large video display on one wall displayed the missile rapidly disappearing in the distance. 1.2 kilometers downrange, 3/4 of a kilometer altitude, climbing at 88 degrees. Boosters off. Main engine in nominal range. Boosters have dropped, a flight technician said. Everything is green. The new engine in the Bloodhound, and its design for operation in space, meant only the control wings remained on the sleek missile for atmospheric control during launch. Thomas knew the missile would now proceed at a more sedate acceleration of 87 meters per second, or 8.8 gravities. The guidance system would make sure the missile maintained its present attitude until the Bloodhound left the atmosphere. Then it would roll and change to more directly point at Alpha Centauri. Or, rather, where they expected the Centauri system to be in 6 years. After all, what they saw in the night sky today was where their system had been 4 years and some months ago. At this time of the year, the Centauri system was only a month or so from being on the opposite side of the Sun from Earth. Hence, the launch so late in the afternoon. It took advantage of the near 45-degree angle of the launch mount and currently southern aim to decrease the maneuvering necessary. Unlike the previous Bloodhound, this one made use of the same, special technology, that allowed the night bus to avoid obstacles. It would be quite inconvenient if the missile plowed into an undiscovered moon or asteroid in the Kuiper belt or Oort cloud. Of course, hitting even a grain of sand at the speeds the missile was expected to achieve would make an explosion that bordered on nuclear in size. Which was why it also had an impressive array of detection spells deployed in front of it, and linked to shields to nudge smaller particles out of the way. That last also eliminated any chance of interacting with any of the junk put in Earth orbit in the last 50 years. The space might technically be nearly empty, but that nearly was still very crowded compared to the space between planets. When the payload separated, its tech would begin sweeping the rear as the missile decelerated. The now shorter Bloodhound would engage its version of the tech to use for the rest of its flight, and also SWCH to the rear when it dropped its last translocator and began decelerating itself. As expected, the modified Bloodhound quickly outran their on-site radar installation and they switched to a feed from the UK air surveillance and control system in Fylingdales. Then came the steady chant of altitude readings as the missile climbed. 10 kilometers, 20, 30, 50, 70, 100. Time mark, coming on 60 seconds mark. Altitude, 157 kilometers. Velocity, 5.2 kilometers per second. Course within 1% of projected. Soon, Thomas knew, the missile would outrun their radar capabilities. Fylingdales, after all, was oriented more towards watching known launches of hostile aircraft and missiles from over the horizon, not staring straight up into space. Switching to Spacecom for continued tracking established. A new system that was integrated into the Yank Spacecom was being installed, but it wouldn't be operational for several more months. This was only the second time Britain had launched a potential ballistic missile from the island. Thomas knew that every foreign agency that could, would be closely watching this launch. The BBC crew that was broadcasting this live, and recording it for posterity, were giving a running commentary in the background. The video and audio from the control bunker were being fed directly to dozens of broadcast networks, both radio and television. Much of the press had started with their own equipment, but after the launch had had to SWCH to the official feed. All systems green, engine nominal, called out one of the technicians. Coming on 2-minute mark. Altitude 626 kilometers. Velocity, 10.4 kilometers per second. Course on track. Everyone there knew that what they had just seen should have been impossible. The missile simply wasn't big enough to carry the fuel it needed to achieve even near-Earth orbit. The BNSC just parroted equestrian special technology. There was a stunned quiet as they watched the radar feed from the Yanks and saw the missile climbing and accelerating, straight as an arrow now. Coming on 10-minute mark. Altitude 15,600 kilometers. Velocity, 52 kilometers per second. Course on track. Beginning to lose as Lock as Ad Astra 2 leaves effective radar range on the United Kingdom's, and mankind's, first attempt at interstellar exploration. All instruments register green for a perfect flight to the Alpha Beta Centauri system. Pryor cleared his throat. Well, I don't think we need to stand around here. We have a chartered plane waiting to take us back to London. As I mentioned in the briefing on the way here, explaining Ad Astra 1, we have a small folder of papers for each of you detailing 2's mission and what we hope to accomplish with this launch. How successful it will be, I really don't know. If the translocators continue to work as expected, in less than 7 years we will be able to go directly from Earth to the Alpha Centauri system in only a few minutes. In a worst-case scenario, we might have to put space stations in place as stepping stones. He stopped and grinned at them. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't care if I had to take 1,000 such steps. That's still less than how far I normally walk when I visit Downing Street. The others smiled. The Lunar Planet Explorer Telescope Complex, PETCO, has already confirmed that there are 2 planets orbiting Proxima Centauri. One has an estimated mass of about 20% more than Earth, an orbital PRD of about 11.2 days, and a distance of about 7.5 million kilometers, 5% of what the Earth is from our Sun. He rubbed his hands together gleefully. Which places it at about the distance where water is liquid on the surface. Whether it is inhabitable is unknown, unfortunately. But we have high hopes. He sighed dramatically. The other is a super-Earth, about 7 times more massive than Earth. It is, unfortunately, 1.5 times as far from Proxima as the Earth is from our Sun, with an orbit of 1,928 days. Also, they postulate Alpha Centauri may have a Neptune-sized habitable zone planet, at about 10% further out from the star than Earth is from our Sun, with a PRD estimated at a year. They hope to confirm that within the next year. Details on all this are in the folder. They slowly exited the building and headed for the coach to carry them to the nearby airport. The press behind them were recapping the launch and waxing poetic about wonderful days ahead in the space program. Plus speculating on which nearby stars had habitable planets and where the United Kingdom's space program was going to go next. The BBC was again applauding the Conservative government's foresight in backing the research that was making the United Kingdom a leader of space and industry. Not to mention the cleaner air, more efficient lorries and cars, and unprecedented recycling efforts that were all rejuvenating the economy. The various space agency members were discussing what they had seen, and wanting to take a good look at the papers in the folders Pryor had promised them. Would it be better to meld their space programs with the United Kingdom's? Or not? So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 53. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.